I was a well-known showman in the capital. I presented a popular weekly program where I invited distinguished guests to sensational conversations over a cup of coffee. I was approaching 30, dressed like a dandy, with straight black hair tied in a ponytail at the nape of my neck and indulged in everything. That sunny day, I was rushing to a recording session when I realized, at the last moment, that there wasn't a single pack of cigarettes in the glove compartment. I stopped at the supermarket and, leaving my red car on the side of the road, went through the sliding glass doors. Fortunately, there was no queue, just a wrinkled old woman at the cash register counter, holding a bagel in her hand and asking something of the cashier, who had curly shoulder-length hair, a nose ring, and the name Paula on her badge. I joined the queue behind the old lady, checking my smartphone as I went. "Grandma, I'm sorry, but I just can't." I heard Paula's voice. "What's taking so long?" I thought, irritated, looking at the expensive watch on my left wrist. "My grandson will send the money tomorrow and I'll pay it," said the old woman in a trembling voice. Her eyes were pitiful, and the hand holding the bread roll was shaking badly. I looked at the clock again. Time was slipping away inexorably. "Grandma, I'd help, but I can't," Paula replied, impassive, and even her curls seemed to sway in a negative gesture. It was clear that the woman would gladly get rid of the old nuisance, but she had no idea how to do it. Grandma, for her part, seemed determined not to give in. I impatiently rubbed the tip of my nose, a habit I couldn't get rid of. "Ladies, it looks like things are definitely dragging on here." I intervened in my usual showman style and randomly pulled a large note out of my pocket, casually tossing it on the counter. "Let Grandma take everything she needs, and please give me those greens over there." The old woman didn't seem to understand what had happened. She was probably a bit deaf. Paula, however, looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment and reached out to take the cigarettes. Hastily, I snatched the pack out of her hand and almost ran for the exit. Fortunately, no one had complained about my car yet, and I settled into the seat, ignoring the crumpled jacket that cost a fortune. I turned on the music and drove off, not noticing someone standing at the entrance to the supermarket, watching me with a pensive look. Exactly 10 days later, I discovered a strange bluish envelope on the windshield. As usual, I was late for the recording, so the appearance of an unknown item in my personal space didn't particularly excite me. "Is that a fine?" I exclaimed out loud. "Really? That's all I needed." I took the envelope and threw it on the dashboard before getting into the car. On the way, I conveniently forgot the mysterious message and only remembered it at the end of the working day. However, when the tired and happy man got back behind the wheel, the blue envelope resurfaced vividly in his memory. I reached for it with one hand, tore the edge with the other, and pulled out a sheet of paper yellowed by time. "This doesn't look like a fine," I muttered softly. I didn't know why my heart was pounding so hard. Perhaps it was the paper itself, or its elusive scent, reminding me of something long forgotten. With trembling hands, I unfolded the sheet only to let it fall into my lap due to the overflow of emotions. What I saw was so unexpected and shocking that I remained motionless for a long time. Voices and images from the past flashed chaotically before my eyes. I tried to push them away, wishing them away like pushing old, worn-out objects to the back of a cupboard, but they reappeared at the forefront of my consciousness, even more vivid and frightening. After a few minutes, I finally let out a loud sigh and, with trembling hands, gently picked up the sheet. No, I hadn't made a mistake, and what I saw wasn't a figment of my imagination. The drawing on the paper represented a wooden construction resembling a marionette. The inscription above it read, "Jorge." The details were also accompanied by signatures written in a painfully familiar handwriting. I wouldn't mistake those curves and lines for any other. Only one person in the world wrote like that, and he was no longer with us. Suddenly, I realized that next to the drawing, someone had roughly sketched a map of some land with a cross in the middle. A pirate treasure map, I thought quickly. I took a pack of cigarettes from my pocket and nervously lit one, without bothering to open the window. I didn't notice the ash falling directly onto my light-colored pants and suede shoes. At that moment, I was far away. I saw in front of me a simple wooden house, a fence with a gate, and I heard the cries of the roosters that woke me up every morning at dawn. Then I remembered with melancholy that there were recordings scheduled for the following morning. I needed to go home, go to sleep, and wake up for another day in the life of a successful showman. I picked up my smartphone and dialed the number of Carla, a young model I had recently met at one of the social events. "Hi, Miguel. We won't be able to meet today," the girl said quickly. "I'm at a reception, you know. Everyone's here, from actors to directors. I can't leave, sorry." I didn't reply, silently pressing the end call button. Carla's animated voice, which had once charmed me, now sounded forced and artificial. My hand instinctively reached for the glove compartment. I opened it and started rummaging around inside, finally finding a rustic wooden box that fit in the palm of my hand. I opened the box, revealing a wooden ladybug that I had carved as a child, painted red with black dots applied delicately with a fine brush. As I looked at the wooden insect, tears unexpectedly welled up in my eyes. I couldn't remember the last time I had cried. Over the years spent in the capital, my heart had been encased in a thick armor that seemed impenetrable. For a long time, that suited me perfectly. But an inner voice whispered that it couldn't go on like this. I had to find out who had sent me the strange envelope, a message from the past. I started the engine and set off. Initially, I wanted to stop by the house to pick up a few things, but my hands confidently guided the car out of the city. I realized that this was for the best. I was afraid of changing my mind at the last moment. I spent the whole night on the road and arrived in the small town, more like a village, at dawn, where I spent all my childhood and youth. The memories of the past became clearer and more vivid in my mind. There I was, just a boy, running down to the lake to see the fat red carp. There was my grandmother buying me mint ice cream in a crunchy cone. And there was my grandfather. I cut the memory off abruptly. Thinking about my grandfather was too painful. I concentrated on the road, although at that time of the morning there was no one else on it but me. I passed familiar buildings that hadn't changed a bit over the years. I stopped at a gas station to fill up and get a snack. Behind the counter, a young woman called Alba, as indicated by her badge, was dozing off. She looked very familiar to me. I stared at the girl's face and her straight dark brown hair for a while. Then I remembered seeing her when I was a little girl of 5. Noticing my gaze, Alba woke up and greeted me warmly, made coffee, and heated up a hot dog. Of course, she didn't recognize me. I thanked the girl and left. The coffee refreshed me and I got back behind the wheel. I didn't have much further to go. I drove in silence, concentrating on the road I knew like the back of my hand. In fact, nothing had changed there. It seemed that time had inexplicably ignored that corner of the earth. I turned into a narrow, winding alley, drove a few meters and stopped next to a gate painted bright red. Behind the fence was an old 2-story house in a slightly dingy shade of pink. I didn't want to look to the right, but my treacherous gaze slid down the street. I was right about my feelings. Everything remained the same there, and where there should have been a neighboring house, there was only emptiness. I coughed, thinking I smelled the same smoke that had haunted me for so long. It couldn't be. The fire had been extinguished over a decade ago. Apparently, the smell still hadn't dissipated from my painful memories. I felt dizzy for a moment, but forced myself to take a deep breath, as one of the many psychiatrists I had seen had taught me when trying to deal with the consequences of a childhood trauma. I took 5 or 6 deep breaths and felt a little better. Taking a step towards the red gate, I found myself so close that I could touch its cracked surface. How many times had I opened that gate in my dreams, and now, looking at it in reality, I couldn't forgive my own cowardice. Finally, I pulled the handle, but the gate was locked. So I rang the bell, which had miraculously remained untouched by time. The sound echoed in the clear air, but there was no answer. Everything in the house remained still, as if I were looking at a bulky image. I felt uneasy. What if all this was still just a dream? Fortunately, I remembered that it was still early. Even if someone was in the house, they were probably fast asleep. To confirm my assumption, I carefully examined the windows. The glass looked clean, and I noticed well-tended flowers on the sills. So the house was inhabited. That reassured me. I went back to the car, trying not to stare at the eerie emptiness between the houses, sat down in the driver's seat and closed my eyes. At that moment, I fell into a restless sleep. I dreamt of a girl from my childhood, standing by the open red gate, waving at me. I woke up abruptly, as if I'd been shocked. My phone was ringing. I looked at the display, 9 a.m. A call from Claudia, my faithful assistant. Of course, I didn't bother to inform her that there wouldn't be a morning show today. Maybe there wouldn't be any more programs. I sighed and hung up the phone. At that moment, I didn't feel the strength or the will to say anything in my defense. Just then, the red gate opened and a woman in her 50s stepped out onto the street with a wicker basket that she held carefully by its long, comfortable handles. I remembered that basket well. I'd helped her carry it home from the vegetable market many times. Catching the woman's strange look through the glass, I quickly placed the smartphone on the seat next to me and, with trembling hands, opened the door. The woman stood there looking at me in bewilderment, as if she had forgotten where she was going. I approached her, not knowing what to say. For a minute, we stared at each other in silence, and then I opened my arms and hugged her tightly. "Aunt Marta," I whispered. "Miguelito," replied the woman, discreetly wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry too," I said softly. Marta just nodded in response. We stared at each other for a while longer, then the woman suddenly woke up. "Miguelito, come in soon. You must be tired from your trip. I was going to get some fresh milk, eggs, and vegetables, but that can wait. I need to make you breakfast. Aunt Marta, you go. I'll just sit in the kitchen if you don't mind." I picked up a snack at the gas station. Marta led me into the house, where the smell was exactly as it always was, vanilla and orange. This scent involuntarily reminded me of times when things weren't going well in my life, and I needed to calm down. Aurora always smelled like that, even covered in dirt after one of our adventures, even after swimming in the lake. I was sure it was her natural smell. Involuntarily, I looked up, where the girls' room used to be. My gaze didn't escape Marta's attention. "Aurora doesn't live here anymore," she said. Her words sounded mundane, and I didn't understand exactly what Marta was conveying: disappointment, resignation, or deep sadness. I didn't dare ask where she was now. Perhaps Aurora had been married for a long time. The thought made my heart ache painfully. Marta took me into the kitchen and sat me down at the table. "The others are still asleep. The kids have school at 12 and Lisa hasn't worked for a long time." I sat down at the round table covered with a white lace tablecloth from my childhood, which Marta's mother had knitted, and memories flooded back. The sensations were warm, but the bitterness of loss and guilt mixed with them. As if understanding my state, Marta, while continuing to speak, carefully avoided looking me in the eye. "No one is going to bother you or fill you with questions and conversations. The coffee in the kettle is still hot, the sugar is on the table, the cream in the fridge. I'll be back soon." With those words, she left me alone with my past. I quietly inhaled the vanilla scent and immersed myself in memories. I used to live nearby when Aunt Marta's family moved into this house. My parents died, so I was looked after by my grandparents. My grandfather made wooden dolls. His workshop was in the right wing of the house, adjacent to a small semi-empty room. There was a window in the wall between them, and Grandma sewed red satin curtains for it, serving as a curtain. At weekends, Grandpa put on puppet shows. He invented the pieces himself and performed them with such skill, voicing the characters with different voices, that the children from all over the neighborhood were enchanted. They crowded into the room like sardines in a can, eager for the show to start. Aurora, Aunt Marta's eldest daughter, also came to watch the puppet shows. She was quiet and shy, and at first I didn't even notice her. But one day, Grandpa invited Aurora to the workshop to show her how he made a new doll. Until then, only I had been honored with this privilege, so I was intrigued. "Why did you invite this girl?" I asked Grandpa later. "I thought she looked sad and lonely, so I wanted to cheer her up." I secretly began to observe Aurora. I discovered that we were classmates, but Aurora usually sat in a corner and didn't talk to anyone. Most of the time, her attention was absorbed in a book. I noticed that Aurora was reading something different every time. Once I followed her after school and found myself in the town library. I had never been there before and had never seen so many books anywhere else. Aurora was returning the volumes she had read and picking out new ones, a whole pile. It was obvious that they were heavy to carry. I couldn't resist and approached the girl. "Let me carry it," I offered. Aurora looked at me in silence, and I noticed that her eyes had an unusual emerald hue. Understanding that she could trust me, she nodded gratefully and handed me the books. Thus began our friendship. From then on, I would wait for Aurora every morning at the red gate so that we could go to school together. I would take her backpack and we would walk slowly through the streets, hardly speaking to each other. I liked to watch how the rays of the morning sun touched the strands of Aurora's dark brown hair, making them look golden. I wanted to touch them, but of course I didn't dare. One midday, as we were walking home from school, Grandpa called out to us from the studio window. "Come here, I've got something for you." He winked. Aurora and I ran into the studio. Grandpa handed us each a wooden box. We opened it and were amazed. Inside were little wooden ladybugs. "Why aren't they colorful, Grandpa?" I asked. "I thought you'd like to paint them." We sat down at the table and picked up the brushes. Soon, our ladybugs became almost real. After that, we often went to Grandpa's studio after school and helped him create new dolls. Aurora particularly liked one of them, a blonde with blue eyes called Lucia. She held her in her hands, brushing her hair. Seeing this, her grandfather gave Lucia to Aurora as a present. "Lucia is very lonely," the girl confessed one day. Grandpa and I exchanged surprised glances. Aurora rarely spoke. "Does she need a friend?" asked Grandpa. Aurora blushed and nodded silently. Then Grandpa took out a sheet of paper and started to draw. He wanted Lucia to like her new friend immediately, so he consulted Aurora about the details every minute. It flattered Aurora that Grandpa asked for her opinion. Finally, the design of the new doll was ready, and Grandpa promised to start making it the next morning. "What will Lucia's friend be called?" I asked. Grandpa looked at Aurora, who blushed again. "Jorge," she replied softly. Grandpa nodded and wrote the name of the new doll above the drawing. Aurora and I watched Jorge's birth with excitement. Grandpa took his time over every detail, carefully and meticulously. Jorge was almost ready when it all happened. A noise interrupted my memories. I looked up and saw a boy of about 15 coming down the stairs, staring at me intently. "You must be Manuel," I deduced. "The last time I saw him, he was just a baby." The boy nodded. "I'm Miguel, an old friend of your family," I introduced myself. The boy shrugged. A man of few words, just like his sister, I thought. "What do you like?" I asked, breaking the silence. Manuel nodded silently towards the wall. I turned my head and was surprised. Why hadn't I noticed that before? The kitchen wall, which used to be empty, was now covered in maps of different places. I stood up and approached to take a closer look. They were all hand-drawn, with various markings. "Your sister loved maps too," I said, feeling the weight of nostalgia in my words. "Yes, she gave me a book about pirate treasures, and that's how it all began," the boy said unexpectedly, but I didn't seem surprised. Manuel's words brought another memory to mind. It happened around the same time that Grandpa started making Jorge. That morning, as usual, I waited for Aurora at the red gate. She appeared with her eyes mysteriously shining. "We're not going to school today," she announced. "Why?" I asked in surprise. "We're going to read a book," Aurora whispered mysteriously. I was intrigued. I wasn't a big fan of books like Aurora, but there was something in her voice and the way she emphasized the word book that made me believe I was about to have an exciting adventure. We ran down to the lake and sat on the shore. In Aurora's bag were sandwiches and a thermos of hot chocolate. She pulled out the book and my eyes lit up with excitement. "Pirate stories," I exclaimed, and Aurora laughed happily. We read the book all day and then built a pirate ship with the planks we found on the shore. Later, Grandpa found us. We were severely reprimanded, but that didn't diminish the impression of that serene, warm day. I remember that it was then that Aurora and I shared a dream: to find pirate treasure, although fate had other plans. "Have you met?" I heard Marta's voice behind me. She was at the table, unpacking groceries from the basket. Fresh eggs, vegetables, cheese, homemade milk, jam. Manuel, sitting in a chair with his chin resting on his long, skinny legs, muttered something indistinct in reply. "Yes, Manuel told me about his hobby. I answered for both of us. "Oh, those maps," Marta complained. "They're everywhere. Soon the whole house will be full of them. And how many conversations we've had about pirate treasures." "It's a good thing he's grown up and stopped believing in them," Manuel grumbled, indicating with his demeanor that none of this had anything to do with him. Suddenly, I froze in place, remembering the scribble on the yellowed sheet of paper. I needed to look at them again. "Excuse me, I'm going to the car," I stammered, hurrying to the door. I crossed the yard, opened the red gate, and stepped out onto the street. At the side of the car, I turned back towards the open rectangle between the houses, and the smell of burning hit my nose sharply. "It's just my imagination," I reminded myself, opened the door and started looking for the sheet with the drawing. After a sleepless and restless night, I couldn't remember where I'd put it. The smell of burning haunted me, and for a moment, it seemed as if I was enveloped in burning heat. My head spun and I sat up, burying my face in my hands on the steering wheel. "It will pass soon. Just breathe deeply," I reminded myself silently, but the visions didn't recede. On the contrary, the scenes from the past took over my consciousness with renewed vigor. I could no longer resist them. It happened on the day Grandpa was supposed to finish Jorge. I was walking home from school alone in the middle of the day. Aurora had a stomachache and the teacher let her go home. I wanted to accompany her, but I wasn't allowed. The whole class was taking a test. A few blocks from home, I could already sense that something was wrong. People were talking anxiously, pointing to the smoke rising above the rooftops. I heard the word fire several times. I knew it was very dangerous, but it never crossed my mind that it could happen to me and my family. Then I saw familiar faces, neighbors. They were running down our street, shouting loudly as the space around them got smaller and smaller. The rest seemed like a dream. I heard sirens from fire trucks, tried to push through the crowd, called out for my family, and finally found myself in Grandpa's strong arms. "It's all right, Miguelito. It's all right. We're all safe and sound. It's just a house," I cried. I was so used to our big, cozy house where objects, furniture, and even carpets seemed alive. And then a thought crossed my mind. "What about Jorge, Grandpa?" I shouted. It was too noisy around, and if my voice had been drowned out by 100 other sounds, then maybe Grandpa wouldn't have heard me. But Grandpa heard me. He knew how important Jorge was, how the children were waiting for him. He released me from his embrace and ran into the burning workshop. No one dared to stop the owner. I waited with my heart pounding. Several minutes passed, but Grandpa didn't appear. Maybe Jorge got scared and hid, and Grandpa's looking for him, I thought. But he'll find him. He'll find him very soon, and everything will be fine. I waited and waited, but nothing happened. And then the worst happened. The roof collapsed, and the air was pierced by Grandma's desperate scream. I opened my eyes. The memories beyond that were blurred, more like a fog. I didn't understand what was really happening and what was only in my head. We lived with Marta, and Grandma longed terribly for Grandpa and our house. She hardly left her room. I kept going to school, even though the wound inside me was bleeding, making it hard to breathe. Aurora was always there, holding my hand on the way to and from school. As usual, we spoke little, but the scent of vanilla and orange saved me from falling into the black abyss of despair. Once, Aurora wanted to talk to me about her grandfather, but as soon as she mentioned Jorge, I had a hysterical fit and spent a week in hospital. After that, Aurora became even quieter and spent most of her time with books, afraid to look me in the eye. Then her grandmother passed away, unable to recover from the loss of her husband. When I turned 16, I ran away, realizing that I could no longer stay at Marta's house. Before leaving, I quietly went into Aurora's room and stared at the sleeping girl for a long time, feeling like I was saying goodbye to her forever. I woke up to someone touching my shoulder. I turned my head and saw Marta's worried face. "Are you all right, Miguelito?" the woman asked. "I was worried when you didn't come back for so long. The car door was open." "I think I fell asleep," I replied. I looked around and noticed Jorge's drawing peeking out from between the seats. I carefully took it out and, getting out of the car, unfolded it to show Marta. "This is a sketch of a doll made by Grandpa in these notes." "I don't remember them." Marta examined the drawing. "This is Aurora's handwriting," she finally said. "She was also obsessed with treasure hunts and pirate treasure. You know that better than I do. But how did her grandfather's drawing end up with her, and why did she draw a map on it?" "Marta, where is Aurora now?" I finally plucked up the courage to ask. "She lives in the capital. She rarely comes home. She calls once a week, but usually just to be quiet on the phone." "Has she found someone, gotten married?" I asked, feeling my heart stop as I waited for the answer. Marta shook her head. "I don't think there's a lonelier soul in the city than our Aurora, and that saddens me deeply." Marta cried again, but I suddenly felt very light. "I want to see her, Marta. Please give me her address." I drove confidently as the day outside gradually faded into a warm evening. Aurora's address was entered into the GPS, and sensing the closeness of the meeting, I could clearly feel my anxiety. Seeing my childhood friend after so many years was no joke, but I knew I needed Aurora now more than ever. I made a brief stop at home to shower and change. The answering machine was full of unheard messages, but I didn't pay any attention. I quickly got ready and got back behind the wheel. Aurora lived in the southern part of the city, where small houses nestled into the hillsides. I smiled. I had no doubt that this girl wouldn't choose a skyscraper for her life. Even in the bustling capital, Aurora had found a place she loved, as quiet and secluded as she was. I quickly found house number 17. A solitary vanilla-colored lantern burned above the porch, and my heart suddenly beat faster. I climbed a few steps and rang the bell. The tinkling sound of a bell echoed from inside the house, then all was silent again. The silence refused to be disturbed. The house was empty. I looked at the clock. It was about 9 in the evening. Where could Aurora spend the night? The library. But they've been closed for a long time, I muttered, rubbing the tip of my nose, a childhood habit I'd inherited from my grandfather and resorted to in difficult situations. I was about to leave when something familiar caught my eye, something similar that I had seen recently. I leaned closer. Between the door and the jamb, there was a corner of blue paper. I pulled it out, and in my hands was an envelope, exactly like the one with Grandpa's drawing on it. Impatiently, I tore the edge and took a piece of paper out of the envelope. I immediately recognized Aurora's light, slightly flamboyant handwriting. "Meet me at our place," I read aloud. "Aurora, are you serious?" I exclaimed, and unexpectedly started laughing. It was the best joke of my life. I got in the car, grabbed a double espresso at the nearest cafe, and set off. On the way, I stopped several times to get more coffee and even dozed off in one of the parking lots. At dawn, I was at the lake. I immediately noticed a bright orange tent and the remains of a campfire nearby. I returned to the car and went to the nearest supermarket, where I picked up some bread, cheese, and sausages. I returned to the lake, lit a fire, and started preparing breakfast. It wasn't half an hour before the tent stirred. "I really hope it's Aurora in there and not some muscular 6-footer, I thought, laughing. The zipper at the entrance to the tent opened, and I felt relieved and happy to notice a delicate female hand. Then its owner appeared. She hadn't changed much. The same long, dark brown hair, the same emerald eyes, and pale, almost translucent skin. Aurora looked at me in surprise, as if she didn't believe I was really there. "Hello, Aurora," I said softly. She didn't say a word, just tilted her head slightly and smiled in response. But I knew the value of her smile. I moved closer and hugged her. Aurora pressed herself against me with her fragile body, as if she was afraid that I might disappear again, and then she cried. "Why are you crying, darling?" I asked. "I'm here with you, Jorge," Aurora whispered. "It's my fault." I looked into her eyes. "What are you guilty of?" Aurora bit her lip. "That day, my stomach didn't hurt," she confessed very quietly. "I lied to the teacher. I really wanted to see Jorge. I hid in his grandfather's studio. Everything went cold inside me, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and exhale. Now was not the time for a panic attack." "What were you doing there?" I caught Jorge. "Why, Aurora? I wanted to hide him like a treasure so that we could dig him up together later. I took him down to the lake to do it. When I got back, I found out about your grandfather." I closed my eyes. "So Jorge wasn't in the studio anymore?" "No, he wasn't. Forgive me." I heard Aurora whisper. I looked at her. Her big emerald eyes were very close, and there was such a deep sadness in them that I couldn't hold back the tears. They ran down my face. "You're not to blame for anything, Aurora," I replied. "I'm to blame." Aurora stroked my hair, as if to push away all the sadness, bitterness, and guilt I'd been carrying around inside me all these years. "Forgive yourself too," Aurora whispered softly. "Your grandfather didn't want you to be sad. He always said that life is meant to be lived with joy." She hugged me and I cried silently, while the scent of vanilla and orange enveloped me, giving me peace and tranquility. Afterwards, we had breakfast by the fire. Aurora said softly, "Do you think Jorge is still here?" I buried him under those willows. "Let's check," I replied. I brought some tools from the car, miraculously found in the trunk, and together we unearthed a simple wooden box where Jorge was. "Where's my girlfriend? I don't want to be alone," I said in a thin voice, imitating the doll's speech. "She's in her backpack." Aurora smiled. "Lucia has been with me all these years, waiting for Jorge." The girl was silent for a while and then added, "And I was waiting for you, Miguel. I watched your show every week. I thought you had changed a lot, become insensitive. But when I accidentally saw you helping Grandma in the supermarket, I realized that you were still the same Miguelito. So I decided to give you Jorge's drawing." I looked at Aurora with gratitude and love. "Aurora, I ran away from myself and my memories for so long, but it was a dead end. For a moment I frowned. Then the creases in my forehead smoothed out and I laughed. How glad I am that fate gave me that old lady. Thanks to her, I found you again, my Aurora."